So we're looking at how people have understood the resurrection post-Enlightenment, when science and fact and empirical evidence become so important. Last week we talked about a guy named Strauss who introduced this category of myth. Now again, we hear the word myth and we think untrue thing like Zeus and his thunderbolts. The Bible, at the time of the Bible, people had a mythic worldview. They didn't go so much into science and understand all these things. For instance, they thought women were just vessels for babies, that they contributed none of the DNA or anything, that it was because they didn't have all that information yet. So myth was a way they understood the world. So with Adam and Eve, it's not that they believed that there were two humans that started out everything. They believed it was a mythic story that told a deeper truth about how God creates and how the purpose of creation, how we're in God's image. Not that we started with two people and everybody's descended from those two. And they didn't even believe that because, again, they have other people showing up right after that for Cain and Abel. Well, Abel's dead. Cain to get married to. So they just put it in there because, again, they're not trying to make every piece of the story fit together because it's a myth. It doesn't need to do that. So Bultmann kind of continues this idea of resurrection in this kind of mythic tale type. So we'll start with the idea of miracles in history. Bultmann shares Strauss's basic conviction that in the scientific age, it's impossible to believe in miracles. As a result, belief in an objective resurrection of Jesus, meaning it objectively happened, you can observe it from the outside, is no longer possible. However, it may well prove to be possible to make sense of it in another manner. So Bultmann argued that history is a closed continuum of effects in which individual events are connected by the succession of cause and effect. So the resurrection, in common with other miracles, would disrupt this kind of closed system. Because once you have something get out of the system, it upsets everything else. It changes the cause and effect patterns. So he argued that in Enlightenment thinking, you can't think about miracles in the same way. So he went with this idea of myth. So why myth? So belief in an objective resurrection of Jesus, although perfectly legitimate and intelligible in the first century, cannot be taken seriously today, according to Bultmann. He's like mid-20th century, early to mid-20th century. He says it is impossible to use electric light and radio equipment and when ill to claim the assistance of modern medical and clinical discoveries and at the same time believe in the New Testament world of spirits and miracles, said Bultmann. That we can't be thinking demons are causing all these things, we have science. The human understanding of the world and of human existence has changed radically since the first century, with the result that modern humanity finds the mythological worldview of the New Testament unintelligible and unacceptable. We can't just jump into that world of the Bible and think we had everything be a one-to-one correspondence and be able to fully understand it. It's like if we went to China and we don't speak Mandarin, we can communicate in some ways. We can point to things, we can use gestures, some words might be there, but we can't just jump into China and live and communicate the same way we do here. It's the same thing with understanding the New Testament world. There's going to be some ways to understand things, some points of similarity, but there's so much, there's different ways of even thinking about understanding the world, we miss so much of it. So when we read the Bible, we often miss a lot of the meaning because we aren't reading it with the same eyes and ears as the people who wrote it and would have first heard it. So as we look next week on some of these texts that may line up with different things with the abortion debate, they had completely different ways of understanding. So we'll look at some Jewish midrash and Talmudic understandings of certain texts, and that's very different from modern Christians' views because they're viewing the texts thousands of years later, and we get their interpretations, but the people who were on the ground then had a very different interpretation. And then the Christian worldview is different from the Jewish worldview. So how you interpret is completely different. So we have to keep in mind when we're reading the Bible that certain things aren't one for one. Marriage in the Bible is completely different from marriage today. If you try to make it a one-to-one equals, you're going to get lost on things. So you have to keep that in mind. So for this reason, the resurrection is to be regarded as a mythical event, pure and simple. The resurrection is something which happened in the subjective experience of the disciples, not something which took place in the public arena of history that you can write about, see, experience. For Bultmann, Jesus has indeed been raised. He's been raised up in the kerygma, the Greek word for teaching and preaching. The preaching of Jesus himself has been transformed into the Christian proclamation of Christ. So you had this idea there's this historical Jesus, but now after his death, you start talking about him as Jesus the Christ. You start talking about him, not just what he talked about. Jesus never went around and said, hey, I'm the Christ. Tell you all these things about you need to believe in me and all this. He didn't really go through with that. He talked about God, the kingdom of heaven, all of these things, but he didn't kind of lift himself up to the level of the Christ or even God. That happens after the death. So that's what Bultmann's saying, is he's been raised in a new way. So now we talk about Jesus instead of the things Jesus talked about. Jesus talked about God and Scripture and the world and the difficult things of religion, politics, and money. We find it easier now to talk about Jesus because it's safe to talk about Jesus. Oh, he gives us life. Let's talk about him. Let's not talk about the things he talked about. So for Bultmann, Jesus is getting raised up in the kerygma. He takes on a new dimension. So there's this difference between the historical Jesus and the Jesus of kerygma. So historical Jesus is who Jesus actually was, what he said and did. We really have very, very little information about that because the Gospels aren't history books. If you try to understand historical Jesus through the Gospels, you're going to get confused because they argue with each other. What day Jesus died, how long Jesus had his ministry, when he did this, when he did that, because they're not writing historical textbooks about a human man. They're writing about the risen, resurrected Jesus, the Christ. And so they're writing books that proclaim and not that define, not that are historical textbooks. So when you start trying to read the Gospels as history, you're getting lost. It's like if you try to read the Da Vinci Code as historical fact about how the world really is, you're going to end up sounding a little crazy because it's not a history book. So too often we read non-history as history. The Gospels aren't history. So it's impossible to know too much about the historical Jesus. What we have is the Jesus of kerygma, this resurrected Jesus of teaching. So Bultmann says, the real Easter faith is faith in the word of preaching which brings illumination. If the event of Easter Day is in any sense an historical event additional to the event of the cross, it is nothing else than the rise of faith in the risen Lord, since it was this faith which led to apostolic teaching. The resurrection itself is not an event of past history. All that historical criticism can establish is that the first disciples came to believe in the resurrection. So consistent with his anti-historical approach in general, Bultmann directs attention away from the historical Jesus, who he really was and the things he actually did, because it's almost impossible to know, toward the proclamation of Christ, what the Gospels have him do and say, and what the early church proclaimed about him. So again, in the Gospels, Jesus may not have actually said those things, but they're added to him later as things he might have said, or combined stories of people. So did Jesus say all those things in John? I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the good shepherd. I am the gate. I'm the bread of life. I'm the light of the world. Maybe. But if those were so important, why didn't the other Gospels write them down? It's more that style of saying things was more a philosophical, rhetorical style about 150 years later, that the people who wrote the Gospel of John and the Johannine epistles and the book of Revelation, that's kind of their school of thought. So consistent with what Jesus said, who he was, what he's been talked about, proclaimed about, we're going to now use this rhetorical style to fit that, to share these important truths to fit our certain audience. Kind of like, I was really disappointed as a kid to find out Franklin W. Dixon wasn't a real person. Do you know who Franklin W. Dixon was? The author of the Hardy Boys books is Franklin W. Dixon. There is no such person. It's a bunch of different people who write and take on a similar voice. I was heartbroken. Like, there's no Monty Python. That's not a dude. I was like, what? There's no guy named Monty Python? This is crazy. It's kind of similar to some of these gospel ideas. Like, it's this, we don't know if Jesus actually said these things. It's the creation of people who look back and have a certain audience to write to, that we want to get these truths across. The best way for me to do it is by saying it this way. The best way for me to do it is by saying it this way. I had a sermon at 8 o'clock that was different from 10:30 because the audience is very different. And how you talk and teach about things differ by who I'm talking to. We should do that. And the gospel writers do the same thing. So faith in the church as the bearer. Boltmann says, faith in the church is the bearer of the kerygma, is the Easter faith, which consists in the belief that Jesus Christ is present in the kerygma. So in this preaching and teaching, Jesus is present with us. Kind of like we say sometimes that, your dearly departed mother's still with you, the lessons she gave, the things she taught you, the memories you make, how you keep her alive in the recipes you cook. That's what Boltmann's kind of saying about Jesus. Jesus is still alive because we're still proclaiming all these things, living these things. In other words, for Boltmann, the resurrection is the act of Christ being lifted up into the teaching and preaching of the church. Christ lives on the message and actually becomes even more powerful, like Obi-Wan Kenobi, as the church proclaims him as the Christ. Boltmann isn't worried about whether the resurrection was a thing that could have been seen and experienced 2,000 years ago, but is concerned with how Christ is proclaimed in the teaching of the church today. He's like, I can't know for sure. Doesn't matter. I believe these things. I think these things are important. I'm holding on to this. Now remember, Boltmann's trying to deal with a world that is more and more advanced scientifically and all of that. So he's trying to make the resurrection and the teaching and proclamation of the church still relevant. And he's trying to say, hey, still believe that this guy was swallowed by a fish and lived in the belly for 3 days. People are going to be like, I can't do that. I so often hear from people who get presented with a faith as a child saying, these are all things that happen and are totally true. And then as they get older and learn more about the world, they're like, I can't believe this to be true. So I can't believe these things to be true. I can't believe the rest of it to be true. So we set up kids to not believe in the church later because we tell them, you have to believe God created the world in 7 24-hour days. And you have to believe that 2 of every animal went on this ark, when often they're more mythic stories. And the Bible says that 14 animals went on the ark too, so that's a different story. But we set people up sometimes that if you don't think this way, you can't believe. But as they get older, they think for themselves, because I can't believe some of this stuff, does that mean I have to leave all of it behind? We have to do a better job kind of managing that. So that's one of the things Boltmann's working with. For him, it's like, if I can at least get there to be a way for people to still understand and believe the importance of this teaching without believing in the actual resurrection, we're going to lose everybody, or a whole lot of people. So I have to do something to make this still important. And it's that contextualization that he might not have thought this 300 years ago or felt the need for it. And so constantly the church is focusing and shifting how it talks about things because people have different needs and what they need to hear and believe as we grow. Because it used to be like God caused the rain we want to rain. Now we know more about precipitation and condensation and all of these things. So this idea of the God of the gaps, in the beginning, God was the answer for everything we didn't understand. Which is a problem because as we understand more, God shrinks and shrinks and shrinks and shrinks and shrinks. And what we think God does. And so we set ourselves up from the beginning to have a faith that diminishes rather than a faith that expands. So we have to kind of rethink how we do things. So now other theologians have taken Boltmann and gone further and further. So now there's more people, as we've expanded time and thought about things, have different ways to believe both in this idea of the myth, but also in the actual historical event. And we'll get to that in the weeks to come, just not next week, because that'll be a special one. It's probably longer than 11 minutes, fair warning. It's hard to cover everything. It still won't cover everything, but I'll have a packet for you, and you can kind of go from there. Questions, comments, snide remarks? All right, thank you all very much. Yes, Matt.